The wind howled like a warning as she stood trembling at the cliff's edge, wrist bound tightly with coarse rope, a burlap sack masking her fear-soaked face. The icy stone beneath her bare feet bit into her skin, while behind her, voices whispered, cold, cruel, and final. No trial, no mercy, just a sentence carried out in silence. Her heart pounded like a drum, not from fear of death, but from the betrayal that brought her there. She was only 18 when they tied her hands, covered her face, and threw her off a cliff because she dared to say no to a powerful man. Her stepfather stood there, watching. They thought she'd vanish into snow and silence. But fate had other plans. She didn't fall into death. She fell into destiny. In the raw stillness of an Arizona canyon, where winter wind whispered like ghosts across snow-draped ledges, 18-year-old Evelyn Cates stood at the edge of the world. Not by choice, but by betrayal. She had said no, that was all. It was no to Mayor Delton Briggs, a man whose ambition was as towering as his cruelty, a man used to owning everything he looked at, including people. But Evelyn didn't lower her eyes. She didn't flatter. She didn't obey. And for that, she was bound with rough rope, gagged with a rotting burlap sack, and led to the cliff like livestock. Worse still, among the men who held her fate in their hands was her own stepfather, Harlan Cates. A man who once brushed snow from her shoulders now stood silently as Mayor Briggs delivered her sentence with a slurred whisper and an unforgiving nod. They didn't raise a gun. They didn't dig a grave. They just threw her. One moment she was standing on frozen stone. The next, there was nothing but air. Her scream was lost to the canyon wind. Her body fell like a broken thought through pine branches in bitter wind until, by chance or miracle, a narrow ledge broke her fall. Pain exploded in her ribs. Snow filled her lungs. But she was alive, barely. Unseen, abandoned, she drifted in and out of the void. The world narrowed to blood, cold, and silence, until a shadow came. Not a rescuer, not a hero, a presence, steady, wordless. He didn't gallop in. He walked, deliberate, measured, calm as snowfall. His name was Greyhawk. He knelt beside her, his hand pressing gently to her throat. "You are alive," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. Certain, grounded, real. Then wordlessly, he wrapped her in a fur-lined cloak and lifted her with care. No questions, no rush, just warmth against a backdrop of ice. When she next opened her eyes, Evelyn was lying on thick furs inside a small lodge tucked into the belly of the forest. Cedar smoke drifted through the air. A fire crackled at her feet, and across the flames sat the man, Greyhawk, his expression unreadable, his posture still. He didn't speak. He didn't probe. He simply placed a wooden cup of warm tea by her hand and watched the fire. When Evelyn finally whispered, "Why didn't you take off the sack?" His reply was soft but firm. "I don't take what someone isn't ready to give." That single sentence unraveled something inside her. He had seen what had been done to her, but he didn't claim her pain. He made space for her to claim herself. In the days that followed, Evelyn lay mostly in silence. Her ribs ached, her lips cracked, but she was fed. She was safe. She was seen. And slowly the woman who had been discarded began to reassemble herself. First came the comb, left quietly beside her on a folded cloth. It was carved with a feather, not a command, not a demand, just a choice. Then came the gloves, worn, stitched with care, clearly once belonging to a woman. They weren't forced into her hands, they simply waited. Each act of quiet care was a permission. She pulled the comb through her tangled hair. It hurt, but she didn't stop. Every knot she freed whispered, "I am still here." She removed the sack from her head, not with shame, but with resolve. Her bruised face reflected in the bowl of water was not one of a victim. It was one of a girl not yet finished. Greyhawk asked her no questions. He simply moved through the days like a river, splitting wood, leaving warm bread at her side in the morning, repairing a broken fence outside. He did not fill the silence. He honored it. And in that silence, Evelyn found space to breathe again. Not as the property of a mayor, not as the shame of a stepfather, but as something new. One night she found a folded cloth, a wooden pen, and a bottle of ink left beside her bed. No instructions, no expectations, just another offering. She had not written since the day before the cliff. Her name had been taken, her voice muted, her will crushed. But that night by candlelight, she wrote, not for the law, not for the town, not even for Grey Hawk. She wrote for herself, about Delton Briggs, about Harlan Cates, about how it feels to be made invisible and then seen again. And then she wrote something else, a new name, not as a goodbye, but as a beginning. Evelyn Cates' journey is not just the tale of one girl surviving a terrible act of violence. It's a mirror, one that reflects a hidden history of a time and place too often romanticized into dust and gunfire. The Wild West wasn't just saloons and duels at high noon. Behind every wanted poster and wagon wheel, there were women, unheard, unseen, and often punished for their courage. And Evelyn's story is for all of them. She said no. That's it. That was her crime. In a world run by men like Delton Briggs, where a woman's worth was often measured by obedience or beauty, defiance wasn't just unwelcome, it was dangerous. Evelyn didn't challenge him with fists or flames. She simply refused to be owned. That's what made her a threat. But this story isn't just about what was done to her. It's about what she chose to do next. She could have stayed buried, in shame, in fear, in silence. But Evelyn, like so many women history forgot, clawed her way back to the surface. Not with vengeance, not with violence, but with the most radical act of all, reclaiming her voice. And here's where it hits home, because Evelyn's journey doesn't belong to just the 1800s. It belongs to every woman who's been silenced, every survivor who's been told to disappear, every soul who's been betrayed by those meant to protect them. There's something deeply moving about how she heals, not instantly, not magically, but slowly, through firelight, through tea, through the combing of her hair, through the ink of her own words, and through one man's unwavering refusal to take more than she offers. That man, Grey Hawk, is a beautiful subversion of what masculinity looked like in the West. Unlike the cowboys of dime novels or the sheriffs of old Western films, Grey Hawk isn't hardened by conquest or fueled by revenge. He carries his own grief, yes, but he never weaponizes it. He doesn't try to fix Evelyn. He simply sees her. And that, in a world full of people who look away, is no small thing. What makes Evelyn and Grey Hawk's story even more powerful is how closely it echoes real lives. Stories rarely written into textbooks, but whispered down through generations, journals, and the oral traditions of indigenous and settler communities alike. In truth, the Wild West wasn't just wild because of outlaws or gold rushes. It was wild because justice was rarely blind, and more often bought. There's a documented story from the high desert in the 1870s about a Ute woman named Chaska, who found a settler girl left to die by her own traveling party after they were ambushed. The girl, no older than 16, had been badly injured, half-starved, and presumed dead. Chaska didn't just nurse her back to health. She protected her from further harm, taught her how to gather roots and weave baskets, and eventually the girl became part of the Ute village. She married into the tribe. She never returned to her original family. She said she had found the one place she was safe and believed. That kind of cross-cultural compassion is often left out of Western narratives, which tend to pit settlers and Indians against one another like two immovable forces. But history is more nuanced. The people of the land, like Grey Hawk, were not just warriors or hunters. They were healers. They were witnesses. They understood the language of pain, especially when inflicted by systems designed to erase. There's also the case of Sarah Winnemucca, a real-life Northern Paiute woman who became an outspoken writer, translator, and advocate for indigenous rights in the 19th century. She bore witness to violence, displacement, and betrayal, but she chose to respond with education, storytelling, and fierce advocacy. Sarah once wrote, "I will fight no more forever, but I will speak until they hear me." That echoes in Evelyn's story. She doesn't pick up a gun, she picks up a pen. And in doing so, she reclaims the narrative they tried to steal. There's something revolutionary in how Evelyn's story centers not around spectacle, but presence. We're conditioned to believe justice must be loud to be real. But Evelyn's journey shows another way, the quiet rebellion of being still and being seen. When she removes the sack from her face, when she picks up that comb, when she dares to write her own name again, those are acts of resistance. Every morning she wakes up and takes bread from the plate, Greyhawk left. She is choosing life again, and she's doing it on her terms. Greyhawk never tries to control her path. He simply clears the space around it. His calm is not apathy, it's reverence. He treats her not as fragile, but as whole. He doesn't romanticize her pain, nor does he retreat from it. In one of the story's most powerful visual metaphors, he hands her a knife, not as a weapon, but as a reminder. It's not to kill, it's to remind you. You're not prey. There's something beautiful about a man who sees a survivor not as something broken, but as someone becoming. We don't all fall from cliffs, but many of us know what it feels like to be pushed to the edge, by people we trusted, by systems that failed us, by moments when the world went quiet instead of helping. Evelyn's survival isn't neat, it's layered, messy, honest, and ultimately it's empowering. She doesn't return to town with a sword. She returns with a name, a truth, a new kind of strength. She doesn't burn the town down. She makes them look, and that is enough. In a world obsessed with spectacle, her story whispers, but it echoes louder than a gunshot. The streets of Birch Pass had never felt so still. Dust hung suspended in the morning light, and the townsfolk froze mid-step as two figures walked silently down the main road. Figures that shouldn't have existed, at least not anymore. One was a young woman in a sun-faded yellow dress. Her hands stitched it back together, thread by thread. It was modest, worn, but every seam told a story of defiance. Every step she took down that boardwalk was the ghost of a girl they had tried to erase, now walking among them, alive. Evelyn Cates, the girl thrown from the cliffs, was back, and beside her walked Greyhawk, steady and solemn, his presence like a mountain moved by purpose. He didn't speak. He didn't glare. He simply walked beside her, not ahead, not behind, with her. The people of Birch Pass didn't know what to do. Some gasped. Others whispered prayers under their breath. More than a few turned away, as if shamed by the very sight of her. One voice broke through the murmurs. "She's dead, ain't she?" Another followed. "No, that's her. That's Evelyn." She didn't stop walking. Her breath was shallow, heart pounding like thunder in her ears. But she kept moving forward, not toward revenge, but toward the one place where her voice had been stolen, the courthouse. And waiting on its wooden steps, face drawn in disbelief and fear, was Mayor Delton Briggs. His black coat flapped in the wind like the shadow of a lie coming undone. He squinted as she approached. "You really are a ghost." Evelyn's voice was calm, clear. "I didn't fall. I was thrown." The hush that followed was deafening. Briggs laughed, a brittle sound full of false bravado. "Grief does strange things to people. You hit your head, girl. You're confused." But he was speaking too loudly now, and everyone noticed. "You belong to me," he sneered, stepping forward. There was an agreement, signed, sealed, witnessed by the church. "That's not true," said a quiet voice behind them. The crowd turned as Reverend Carver stepped forward, Bible clutched tightly in his hands. There was no contract filed, no wedding banns were read. There was never a marriage to bless. Briggs's face flushed deep crimson. "You forget who runs this town." "Maybe it's time someone else did," said Mrs. Goodwin, arms folded, eyes like steel. "We've all seen your kind of justice, and we're done pretending it's law." Others began to stir. The town seamstress stepped forward, holding up her hands. "I stitch rope burns like those. No one does that to themselves." And then came the baker, old but observant, shaking his head. "She said no. That should have been the end of it." Briggs tried to speak, but words failed him. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He took a step back, then another. No one moved to follow him. No one defended him. And in that silence, Evelyn stood taller. The people had once looked through her. Now they looked at her. And beside her, Greyhawk reached into his leather pouch. With great care, he unwrapped a soft piece of hide, revealing a necklace. One single eagle feather, bound in blue beadwork. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. He placed the necklace gently into her hands. "This is your name now," he said. "You choose how it is spoken." Evelyn held the feather like it was something sacred. Her fingers trembled as she clasped it around her throat. It didn't choke her. It lifted her. She was no longer Evelyn Cates. That name had been spoken through clenched teeth and courtroom whispers. This name was her own, a name born of cliffs and survival, a name she had earned. River's Dawn. The people of Birch Pass didn't cheer. There were no grand celebrations, no gunshots into the sky, only a quiet understanding that passed through the street like wind through pine. They had tried to bury her in silence. She had returned with truth. Later that evening, as the sun bled into the canyon once more, she sat outside the same courthouse steps, watching the colors shift over the land that once tried to forget her. Iron Arrow appeared then. Greyhawk's kin, a young warrior with fire in his eyes and skepticism in his heart. He looked at her long and hard. "My father would not understand this," he said quietly, "but maybe my son will." He turned to Greyhawk. "If she is yours to name, then name her." Greyhawk's voice was soft, nearly lost in the wind. "She already has." They said nothing else. And just when the dust had started to settle, Briggs returned. River's Dawn never went back to the life they tried to bury her in. She didn't return to her old home. She didn't reclaim the title of Evelyn Cates. And she didn't waste her energy on trying to convince anyone who had once looked the other way. Because some lives are not meant to be reclaimed. Some are meant to be rebuilt from the ground up. And so she chose rebirth, not in vengeance, not in defiance, but in creation. She followed Greyhawk south, through mountain passes, past the hush of pine forests, and into a valley where the land hummed with old stories and quiet welcome. A village lay nestled near the curve of a clear river, encircled by wildflower-covered hills and tall cottonwoods that whispered when the wind passed through. It was here, among his people, that River's Dawn found her new beginning. The villagers didn't embrace her immediately. Trust, like spring, arrived slowly in that part of the world. But no one turned her away. No one whispered. No one asked her to explain the bruises that had long faded from her skin, or the ones still healing beneath it. Instead, they made space. A small lodge was built for her, a frame of poles covered in thick buffalo hide, with a smoke hole above and a stone-lined hearth at its center. It wasn't grand, it wasn't polished, but it was hers. And it was more than she'd ever been given before. Inside, she found folded blankets, a wooden bowl carved with feathers, and a bundle of sage tied with twine. She didn't cry. She just breathed and let the silence wrap around her like a quilt. Each day after that began with purpose. She rose before the sun and joined the women at the river. They didn't speak much at first, but they passed her a cloth for kneading. They showed her how to press cornmeal into cakes using hot stones. One woman adjusted her grip gently, wordlessly, with a quiet nod of approval. Every act was its own language. She learned to braid her hair again, but this time with intention. Each twist represented something: courage, memory, breath, strength. Her fingers fumbled at first, but by the end of summer, her braids were firm and graceful, adorned with beads gifted by the children she helped gather berries with. No one called her Evelyn anymore. No one had to. River's Dawn walked through the village not with pride, but with presence. She was no longer the town scandal. She was no longer Briggs's discarded property. She had become her own story. Even Red Moon, the sharp-eyed warrior who had once stared at her with deep suspicion, eventually nodded when she passed. That single gesture was worth more than a dozen greetings. She learned to gather wild roots and dry herbs, to whisper prayers over willow bark, to stitch hide with bone needle. She sat by the old women and listened, not just with her ears, but with her spirit. Slowly, the rhythms of the village became the rhythms of her own body. She had stopped bracing for harm. For the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting for something to be taken from her. She was building something instead, with her hands, with her name, with her choices. As the months rolled into seasons, her story traveled. Not as scandal, not as gossip, but as a quiet legend. People in Birch Pass whispered of the girl who came back from the dead, not with a gun, but with her truth. Mrs. Goodwin told the tale by lamplight to schoolchildren. Reverend Carver spoke of grace and strength instead of shame. And every now and then, a wagon would arrive from some far-off town, carrying someone broken, someone lost. Someone who had heard of the woman who walked away from the edge and kept walking. River's dawn welcomed them, not with sermons, but with firelight, with bread, with listening. One spring evening, Greyhawk approached her as she knelt by the fire, drying bundles of sage. He held a thick wool blanket, its colors bold, deep red, sky blue, and brown as the riverbank. The edges were frayed, but the center shimmered, woven with precision, memory, and love. "My mother made this," he said softly. "She gave it to me when I became a man." He hesitated, then placed it around River's Dawn's shoulders. "Now I give it to you. You are like her, strong where it matters most." She didn't speak. She just reached up and held the edge of the blanket. And in that moment, she knew she was not simply living in this new world. She was now part of it. Years passed. The valley grew lush and green. Children grew taller. Her hands grew stronger. Her laugh, once foreign to her own ears, became common again. And one morning, as the sun began to stretch its fingers over the cliffs, she climbed the trail to the place where her old life had nearly ended. The cliff's edge, the very one they had thrown her from. Only now, she did not tremble. She stood tall. The wind teased her braids. The eagle feather at her neck danced against her throat. Her eyes scanned the valley below, not in fear, but in ownership. That place of pain was no longer her grave. It was her witness. She did not return to mourn the past. She returned to thank the land for catching her, for holding her, for reminding her that even after the fall, there was still a life worth living. As she turned to walk back to the village, the wind carried a child's laughter to her ears. Someone was calling for her. Not Evelyn, not girl, but Mady. River's Dawn, and she smiled. Because that name, born from snow and stone, was hers alone. She had not only survived, she had arrived. And in doing so, she became something the world could not define. Not victim, not ghost, not forgotten. She became her own fire, her own name, her own dawn. Two deputies flanked him, rifles slung across their backs, faces tight with nerves. He pointed at Evelyn, now River's Dawn. "There she is. I have a warrant for harboring a fugitive." The deputies hesitated. Briggs growled, "She's coming back with me." Greyhawk stepped forward, positioning himself between her and the lawman. "She is not yours to take." "What are you gonna do?" Briggs laughed bitterly. "Stop me with that feather?" Greyhawk's reply was quiet, but unshakable. "I don't need steel, just truth." And then Evelyn stepped forward, not behind Greyhawk, but beside him. "You've taken enough," she said, "but not anymore." Mrs. Goodwin's voice rang from the side. "It's over." The deputies exchanged glances, and for the first time in his life, Delton Briggs backed down. He vanished into the trees, into his shame, into the silence he had once used as a weapon. The fire that night burned bright in Birch Pass, not with rage but with renewal. River's Dawn sat with the women who once whispered about her, now passing bread and listening. No one toasted. No one made speeches. But a shift had happened, and the town, like her, had begun to heal. Even in our modern world, stories like River's Dawn still echo. Today the cliffs may not be made of stone, but they still exist. For some, they're betrayal by family. For others, it's being silenced at work, dismissed for their truth, or told they are too old, too broken, or too much. But River's story reminds us, you are not what others throw away. You are what you choose to rebuild. Her name was taken, but she named herself again. Her voice was stolen, but she spoke through action. And in a world that told her she had no place, she made one with her own hands. Maybe that's the lesson for all of us. That healing doesn't always come loud. That love isn't always rescue, it's respect. And that strength is often quiet, like a woman combing her hair after the storm. What would you have done in her place? Would you return to the town that betrayed you? Or would you build a new life beyond it? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe some names are better left behind? Or that facing your past is the only way forward? Thank you for spending this time with us. If River's journey moved you, even just a little, please consider liking this video, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who might need this reminder today. Here on The West That Never Left, we don't just tell stories of the past. We remember the truth still riding with us today. Until next time, may your trail be clear and your name always your own.